Welcome to Momming as a Millennial, the podcast where we explore the intersection of tradition and modern parenting. Have you ever felt overwhelmed trying to balance being a mom with your professional aspirations, all while dealing with side-eye from your parents who think you're doing it wrong? Me too. I'm your host, Christine Gerizzo, a journalist, blogger, and proud mama of 2 young children. I'm so glad you're here with me. Together, we can navigate the complexities of millennial motherhood and find what resonates with our true, authentic selves. Let's dive in. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining me on another episode. Today, I'm so excited to have my first guest, Bryanna Rayford. Bryanna is one of my dear friends. We met at a company that we both no longer work for. Despite living about 270 miles away from each other, we've managed to stay close, often bonding over the challenges of being millennial mamas. Bryanna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so thank you so much for having me today. Like yourself, I'm also a millennial mama. I currently have a 2-year-old daughter and another baby on the way due any moment. I would consider myself a full-time remote working mom while also balancing stay-at-home responsibilities. So in addition to working, I still do everything that I can at the house to take care of my family. My dedication is going to be raising my daughters to be strong and determined through a combination of gentle and stern approaches. But I am very adamant about what is right for my children and doing whatever it takes to make sure that they're safe and boundaries are respected by friends, family, and I'm excited to share.
And I'm so excited to have Bryanna because, like she mentioned, she's going to give birth any minute, and I don't want to be bothering her when she's bonding with her newborn.
Never a bother.
So today we are talking all about boundaries. Love them or hate them, boundaries are an important aspect of parenting, and this is something that I definitely learned along the way. Nobody told me ahead of time. There is so much information out there about boundaries and different forms of boundary setting. I feel like we're going to scratch the surface on this topic today because there's just so much information out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
When it comes to raising children, we all know it takes a village, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Family, daycare, babysitters, you name it. There are a lot of times when our kids are with other adults and we're not around. These adults can influence our kids, so it's important to me as a parent to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes how I want them cared for and raised. So today, I imagine we're probably going to focus mostly on our parents and in-laws, which of course are our kiddos' grandparents, but this topic applies to all caregivers.
Yeah, and I definitely think when it comes to parents and in-laws, it's one of the most important things to have boundaries because I think caregivers come in, at times like a night out babysitting, whereas the in-laws and parents that are around your children, you want them to really show support. This also teaches your kid that what you say is meaningful and that their grandparents are going to back up mommy and daddy. And I think that's the most important thing. So I'm definitely eager to dive more into this topic.
Yeah, I think you're right. Those grandparents are the constant, whereas other caregivers come and go.
Absolutely. And, the love is there. And I'm sure grandparents want to give their perspective on what they did that works best and so on and so forth. But, as cliche as it is, times are different. And I do think, we have to be open to different parenting styles.
Yeah. And I echo your point. I know how much grandparents love their grandchildren. I truly appreciate my parents and my in-laws for how much they show love to my kids, how special they make them feel, and how they prioritize them above all else, including my husband and I, which is great. Research has proven that grandparents have a positive effect in children's lives, from both providing emotional support to being a playmate in ways that parents often don't have time for. And with that involvement and closeness, sometimes comes overstepping, as you mentioned. That could be in the form of undermining the parent's authority or disregarding the rules or schedules that have been established by the parents.
I love that you are talking about research because I also feel like in our day and age, there is a lot more that we have access to, even applying to parenting now. There's so many things out there that we can learn on how to approach our kids in the best ways, whereas our parents didn't have that. And sometimes, even when I share research that I find with my mom and dad, they kind of sometimes look at me like I'm crazy, because the whole thing is you don't have a manual on how to raise a kid. And although that's true, there are some great things out there that we can refer to as parents that can kind of guide us along the way.
Yeah, I think you make a very valid point. There is no manual to raising children, but I like to look at everything holistically. And I think that's where the whole idea of this podcast came from. We can go online and easily search for anything and find a ton of different opinions on the same subject. And then we hear our parents and our grandparents giving us advice. We hear our other friends who are moms or parents giving us advice. And really, it's distilling down all that information and then coming up with what is most comfortable for you. So what is most comfortable for me and how I want to raise my kids might not be the same for you. And I think having that acceptance and understanding and really just like presenting this information, and that's the whole impetus of where this came from. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, or even just a one size doesn't fit all. So even though we might have the same thoughts on, certain concepts with parenting, it might work for our one kid, but not our other kid. So it's also remaining adaptable with the research and the advice and taking what we want from the people around us. But I think ultimately as moms, we're always going to know what's best for our children.
Yeah, so true. No one knows your kid like you do. No one knows the cries like you do, what that means or what they need in a particular moment. Whether or not grandparents have a tremendously close relationship with them, they're never going to be able to understand like a parent does.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, this study that I found from the University of Michigan, it said that half of parents surveyed reported butting heads with their child's grandparent over parenting. And I actually thought that was kind of a low number.
Oh, yeah.
Like half of parents, you would think it'd be more, right?
Yeah. That's what I would think it'd be more.
Yeah, so I agree. Half of parents, that seems very low to me. But it talked about what these clashes could include. And so that was discipline, meals, TV or screen time, and manners. But there's other issues that are even more hot button or more complicated, like sharing photos or information on social media. That's something that I know I've pretty much established a hard line with my family on both sides that no one is to share photos of my children on social media. And I do very sparingly. And usually you'll see on my Instagram that it's the back of their heads or
Yeah.
Or a few years ago when they were a lot younger. We don't know how that's going to play out yet. Like social media, I feel, is still too new. So that I know is something that comes up a lot.
And it's so funny because you would think something as simple as social media wouldn't be considered a boundary when you have children. I've been on social media for a long time now, and it's not until I had a child that I realized how scary it is to have your child displayed on social media. And it's one thing as a mom or a dad to post your child because you're okay with it and you're okay with that photo. But then when now it comes to in-laws, grandparents, whoever it is, they really should be a discussion on what you're comfortable with. But it's also tough because to tell someone to take that off of your social media, it becomes a gray area. Even though it's your kid, it can cause conflict in that case sometimes too.
It is tough. And that's one of my biggest problems with setting boundaries is I don't want to hurt people's feelings. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. At the end of the day, it's your child and you have the final call. But I did want to point out that according to this research scientist, Sarah Clark, she said if grandparents contradict or interfere with parenting choices, it could have a serious strain on the relationship. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with your parents and your in-laws and maybe about how these occurrences have influenced the way that you're currently raising your daughter?
I would say my family dynamic is relatively close to what is known as the enmeshed family. Prior to having a daughter, my parents were very much involved in my life decisions and my emotions and what I do. So I do see that behavior present with my daughter now. They are very involved with what she does at their house. They're very involved if I'm disciplining her, that they want to have a say, not necessarily in a negative way, but to kind of show that they're also mutual authority that are going to back up what I say to my daughter. So I do think now as a mom, I can see that my parents come from a good place. Even though the enmeshed family can be considered somewhat negative, I do think we're at this point in time where we make it work. However, I will say on my husband's side, it is a little bit different because he did not, unfortunately, have that relationship with his mom and dad. He was raised by his grandparents. It's been really hard handling conflict with his mom because it's almost like she's in a position to want to redo things that she couldn't do with my husband. And sometimes her expectations are unrealistic. And it's also hard because it's my husband saying, I don't feel comfortable because I didn't experience this with my mom. But I just think back to your main point of it's our kid and we have to do what we think is right at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you mentioned the concept of an enmeshed family, and I don't know how many people out there are aware of what exactly that is. Do you mind giving a little bit more description on it?
Yes, I learned this terminology when I was going to therapy. Enmeshment describes family relationships that not only lack boundaries, but also roles and expectations are confused. So parents are overly and can be inappropriately reliant on their children for support, vice versa. And in some cases, children are not really allowed to become emotionally independent, or they have the fear of becoming separate from their parents. Even though it may sound negative, and I think I did view this as a negative concept before I had children, I do really think it's now helped me in how I want to approach parenting with my daughter. I think growing up, and I'll just kind of give a little background on that. I'm the first child from my family, and I think they were very strict with me. They wanted to be very hands on in all aspects of my life. So, making decisions, I would second guess myself, or they would always want to know every step that I was taking in school or with friends, relationships. And it got to the point where, sometimes I didn't feel really confident in my decisions, or they would kind of get upset if I didn't make a decision that they necessarily wanted. However, as a mom now, and now being able to relate to my parents, I do know that I was coming from a place of love. Just maybe they have their own trauma that they didn't really necessarily handle growing up, and it kind of got unfortunately deflected onto me. But I do think now as a mom, I want to incorporate a lot more independence. I'll still give my kids what I think is the right thing to do, have their best interests at heart. But if they make a decision that is separate from what I necessarily want, I need to trust and really let them feel confident and secure in any decision they make, and let them know that mommy and daddy will always have their back no matter what.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned therapy too. And I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to commend you on that. So when I was looking into what an enmeshed family meant, the best way I found to understand it is to imagine a big bowl of spaghetti. So for an enmeshed family, the spaghetti noodles are all tangled up together, and you can't really tell where one noodle ends and another begins. In an enmeshed family, everyone's thoughts and feelings are mixed all up together, and it can be hard for each person to have their own space or feelings. And I think that's exactly what you were describing. So people might rely too much on each other or have a hard time making decisions on their own. And just like it's hard to separate one noodle from the tangled mess of spaghetti in an enmeshed family, it's tough for each family member to have their own space or independence. And I think that's where boundaries really come into play. And it sounds like as a family, you have established boundaries over time. And now, especially with raising your daughter, you're making sure that those boundaries are taking place from you to her as well, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on to this example because it's really insane to compare it to a bowl of spaghetti because it's so true. I do think too, the expectations that came from me and my siblings who are years apart. My brother's 6 years apart from me and my sister's 13 years. There was a lot of expectation and that thought of my parents relying on me to help them run the household in their absence. In ways, it's great because it taught me how to multitask and manage and prepared me for motherhood myself, but I was still only a kid and I wanted to do kid things. That's also something that I want to carry into my household. I want my daughters to have the same morals, goals, expectations. I don't want to ever put one's burden on the other. And not saying my siblings were burdens, but I almost felt more of like a mother hen to them because, again, of how involved we were in each other's lives. And it was the thought of making my parents proud and being able to show up for them. And, and again, boundaries did come over time. And I have been able to successfully communicate these thoughts to my parents and how I felt it impacted me today. And they were very receptive, thank God. But I do think it also showed what I do want to take from the family dynamic I had growing up and what I don't want for my kids too.
Totally agree. Just a couple more things on enmeshment and then we can move on. So according to researchers like Salvador Munichin, probably said that wrong, enmeshed families often struggle with healthy boundaries, which can lead to issues such as anxiety, depression, and difficulties in forming healthy relationships outside of the family unit. And other studies by psychologists like Murray Bowen have also highlighted the role of enmeshment in perpetuating intergenerational patterns of dysfunction with families, which I think you've addressed beautifully and are really illustrating how you are stopping that generational pattern from occurring.
Yeah. Like I said, I think being close knit is okay. And it is okay to be very in tune with your children. So I don't want enmeshment to be confused with that. I just do think there's levels of enmeshment where it could be, very toxic and cause that conflict. Or in this case, help individuals to determine the approach they want to take with their kids.
Yeah, 100%. So we're going to move on. I just want to say that boundaries are hard. Having an enmeshed family can make it difficult to set boundaries, but also not having an enmeshed family can make it difficult to set boundaries. I think in any situation, it's not always an easy thing. And we know that there is quite a spectrum when it comes to grandparents' intentions, and we touched on that. I think some grandparents, it's truly innocuous or innocent. This has mostly been my experience, thankfully, especially when my kids were younger. And I think it came from a place that I wasn't comfortable or good at voicing my opinions or concerns and setting boundaries. The grandparents are ready and willing to accommodate my needs, but I've been sheepish in the past about expressing what those needs are. I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, especially when they were helping me out with childcare while I worked. I was always afraid that if I step on someone's toes or if I say something that they don't like, then they're not going to help us anymore, which in hindsight, I know is not realistic. And I've come to realize that in most cases, no one really cares what my boundaries are, and they're actually happy to follow them. So it's just that I need to be clear about what I'm comfortable with. Just a quick story I want to share about that. I remember when my son was first born, my husband mentioned that my father-in-law had bought a car seat for their car. In my mind, I was thinking there is absolutely no way I'm comfortable with them driving my baby anywhere. And actually, for the first few months, I wasn't even comfortable with my husband driving him places when I wasn't in the car. And when we did go places together, I sat in the back seat with the baby for months. I don't even know how long. It was excessive. I realize now that's probably a little bit over the top, but it was just how I felt. And the problem is that I never voiced that boundary to anybody. I just kept it bottled up and hoped it would never come up and that I never had to address it. And it legit stressed me out. Also, knowing that boundaries can change over time. Now my in-laws pick up my son every day from school and I don't even think twice about it. It's not a big deal to me at all. But I still do have some limits when it comes to my kids and cars. Like last year, we were on vacation with my husband's family. We were coming off of a stressful dinner outing where my daughter was wiling out and she was acting like a fool. All I could think about was getting her back to the vacation house and sending her straight to bed. My father-in-law offered to take my son to the park, which is what we were originally planning before the disastrous dinner, but we were in a strange town that none of us were familiar with, and I just wasn't comfortable with them taking him somewhere without me. So I simply said, I'm not comfortable with that. And he said, okay. And that was it. No one's feelings were hurt. No one was upset. I set my boundary, and that was that. And this is something that I have been working on, and I'm pleased to say that I'm getting better at, but it's not easy.
Yeah, this is an interesting story, and I appreciate you sharing not only your original thought, your actions, the way you internalize your feelings, but then how over time, it's changed so much for you. But I do think communicating that is still scary because you don't know how people are going to take it. But there are things as first-time parents that you're just not comfortable with. And sometimes you can't really necessarily explain that. I don't blame you sitting in the backseat. To be honest, I don't even like my husband taking my daughter to the food store without me. Thankfully, your father-in-law said okay and moved on and was happy to support you. But even if he wasn't, it still is not going to change what you want for your kid. But I do think you taking the step to communicate that you were not comfortable with it in a way that was calm, I think that's really a good start. But again, sometimes even as calm as you might be or as open as you might be, it's just you never know the reaction on the other side.
Well, let's talk about that. So on the other end of the spectrum, there's grandparents that just feel entitled to have access to their grandchildren for whatever reason. And they feel what they say or do is acceptable because they raised you, you turned out fine, I did that, and you didn't die. Or they're a parent too, so you should just trust them blindly. And they don't understand that you might have different thoughts or feelings about something and that they need to accommodate your rules or schedules regardless of what happened in the past or how they were raised. So when setting boundaries and grandparents aren't receptive, I would love to hear your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, so I actually have a similar story that involves a car. As I mentioned previously, my husband did not grow up with his mom, unfortunately. And although he still kept in communication with his mom, there still was not that relationship where she would take them places and do things. Like it was very limited. But when my daughter was 9 months, his mom had reached out and wanted to take my daughter to a festival. And the first thing that struck me was she didn't invite us. The second thing was that she had already told us, well, I got a car seat. We want to pick her up and take her for for a couple hours. Although that's nice, I just did not feel right with it, and neither did my husband. The first thing he said was, I don't even remember the last time I've been in a car with my mom. Because she didn't have that relationship with my husband, unfortunately, that trickled into the relationship with us and my daughter. So not that we don't hear from her, but it's once every so often versus with my parents, it's every day, constant FaceTime calls, check-ins. So it was very hard for us to basically explain why we were not comfortable with his mom taking her. And with us just saying as simply as, we don't want her driving with anyone in the car, it really caused an uproar. It was, well, why did I get a car seat? For years, grandkids have been going places with their grandparents. I didn't realize there would be expectations because, I didn't raise you. And it really, unfortunately, led to a falling out because as first-time parents, we're already dealing with so much emotion, fear, anxiety, angst. So I think wanting to isolate us from our daughter for the very first time just did not feel right. And instead of being supportive and understanding and patient, it turned into a fight. And since then, it's just been tough to kind of get that relationship back.
It's tough because you know how you feel and you didn't feel comfortable with that. But then how do you make somebody else see why you don't feel comfortable with that? Or do you need to make them see? And shouldn't they just be supportive and accept that?
The more that we feel supported as parents, and I also think the better relationship I have with my mom, the more comfortable I'm going to feel with her being around my daughter. And that also goes for my husband. If they continue to have a great relationship that's open and communicative and boundaries are talked about and understood, it'll be easier for us to be open with her wanting to do things with our daughter. I think there's nothing wrong with making it clear with what you want for your children.
Yeah, 100% agree. And we're going to get into next what the benefit of establishing boundaries is and why we should be establishing boundaries, even in the best of relationships with our parents or in-laws. But I think we're going to have to break this up into 2 parts and cover all of that next time. So I'll go ahead and end part 1 here. Thanks so much for listening. Remember to follow or subscribe and share with your millennial mom friends. See ya. Thanks for tuning in to Momming as a Millennial. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend or on social. You can find more from me at contemplativemama.com. Until next time.